Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. Today we are going to discuss about the wildlife conservation and protection laws in India, and we find that this wildlife conservation and protection law, as we have discussed in the last lecture about the regulation of the hazardous industries, hazardous substances, hazardous processes in India, on the same pattern what we find there is a kind of an analogous development, and that development is that as the Basel Convention uh, 1989, which was passed at the international level, in India in the same year have framed three major rules on the hazardous substances. Similarly, in the arena of the wildlife conservation and protection law, the first thing to be said that when we had an international law relating to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species CITES in 1972, in the same year we had enacted Wildlife Protection Act in 1972, and that speaks volumes about India's commitment to the wildlife protection. The wildlife conservation and protection law is something very unique in the sense, in the Indian context, that India and Denmark are the two major countries in the world which have ratified almost all prominent and chief conventions in relation to the protection and conservation of the wildlife law in this country. So we can realize the position of India from this very statement that India has always been forerunner in protecting its rich wildlife conservation and protection, and it has been claimed under the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. In this lecture, we will try to see that what is the importance of the wildlife conservation under the context of India's rich biological diversity, and how that the rich diversity and the legacy in India is going to be threatened by the poachers' illegal trafficking, and how in these circumstances that the wildlife and ecosystem is to be preserved. And there has been a complaint regarding the diminishing population ratio of the tiger, and how we can have a very foolproof policy under the Indian wildlife laws and policy to take certain initiative to protect tiger. And we see that how notable wildlife sanctuaries and national park happens to create a kind of an administrative paraphernalia and a structure to go about the legal framework of the wildlife protection in India to preserve, conserve, and protect the wildlife ecosystem in the country. With this, we try to see that when we talk of the wildlife conservation and protection law, a reference to all the leading enactment and the conventions, guidelines, protocol, recommendations are imperative, and therefore we see that the India has participated in all international conventions, right from the important bird and biodiversity area, right from the Ramsar Convention on Wetland and Waterfall Habitat 1971, right from the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, popularly known as CITES 1972, the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species 1979, Indo-USSR Conservation on Migratory Bird in 1984, how these laws of 1972, 1971 and 1979, 1984 and 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity have given a foundation of India's what we can call wildlife conservation and protection law. In this context, we will be looking at how the basic precepts and the policies which have been permeated into the catena of the wildlife conventions and the guidelines and declarations are being translated into the Indian Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. We will also look at the National Wildlife Action Plan, because we have a series of plans, and that plan have taken note of right from National Wildlife Action Plan 1983 to 2001 and 2002 to 2016 and 2016 to 2030 is the another wildlife national action plan which remains in practice. Is something very important, that we do not have any kind of a crisis in the policy prescription and policy in implementation. So after enactment of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, India have come across with a very detailed document in regard to heralding National Wildlife Action Plans in 1983 and 1983 to 2001 and 2002 to 2016 and 2017 to 2031 is the broad range of the entire policy, wildlife policy, which always happens to guide India's wildlife protection and conservation laws in this country. We'll be also looking at the objective and strategy of the wildlife protection. We will look in from the constitutional mandate and duties. We will go into the genesis of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. We will try to see that what are the broad principles and parameters and provisions are engrafted into the Wildlife Protection Act and what are its chief characteristics and feature. We will also try to see the nature and scope of the Wildlife Protection Act in preservation and conservation of the wildlife in India. We will be also looking at the penal provision, which tries to see the contravention of the act and attract some kind of penalties and punishment, and we will see that how this law is going to have a deterrent effect in creating some breakthrough in illegal poaching or illegal trade or trafficking of the wildlife trophies. With this, we see that the definition of the concept of the wildlife, which has been provided in the legislative basis, and we have to understand that what Section 2 of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 try to define the habitat, and it defines the land, and it try to dwell upon the term related to hunting and trade, and also been very cautious in defining the term and its glossaries and commentaries in regard to the taxidermy and trophies, and how these concepts, which has been permeated under Section 2 of the definition and concept of the wildlife, are going to be judicially interpreted by the Indian court, and how they are being applied by the Indian judiciary. That needs to be done, that the judicial interpretation and the interpretation from the conservationist point of view, whether they have a match or a mismatch, that needs to be examined under this lecture. We'll be also looking at certain amendments which have crept into right from 1982, 1991 down to this day. We'll be devoting a separate lecture on the issue that how the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 have undergone to a series of amendment, and all the amendments happens to address the question which are very vital, that what has been the crisis in the entire governance of the wildlife in this country, and according to the needs and aspiration of the conservationists, and as well as the legal objective that this law has been put to at least 10 amendments till date, and those amendments needs a very careful perusal and a very careful examination. We'll be looking also that what are the miscellaneous provisions and rule making power which has been conferred, the delegated legislation, and how the Wildlife Act have developed and swelled in terms of its incorporation of the schedule, the red list, and the other list, which tries to see that what are the endangered species, and a perusal of the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1982, 1986, 1991, 1993, 2002, 2006, and then we will be looking at the function and power of National Tiger Conservation Authority. We will be also mooting the very idea of having a Wildlife Crime Control Bureau and the zoo, and we will see that how Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2013, prior to the specification of the National Wildlife Action Plan 2017 to 31. All these things will be developed with a separate lecture dealing with the uh, contemporary advances in the wildlife laws and policy in this country. We'll be looking at the various dimensions, and we will try to see that how the rule making power of the central government and have resulted into promotion of the wildlife vis-a-vis it also try to protect the tribal and customary people's right, and what are the doctrines which have been evolved by the judiciary and how the judiciary has responded and tried to create a kind of a balance between the nature and man relationship and the tribal and customary and indigenous people. With this, we straightway move to the very crux of the wildlife conservation and protection, and here we find that the importance of the wildlife conservation in this country emanates from the very fact that India is a mammoth country and India's geography support diverse ecosystem, and we have a wildlife in plain, we have wildlife in hill area, we have a wildlife in marine environment, we have a wildlife in mountainous ranges. So the India's geographic dividend and rich and agroclimatic conditions have given rise to Himalayas, the desert, the plateau, the wetlands, the island, and the coastline. How in all these sectoral and diverse geographical spread of 320 million hectares and a coastline of 7,516 kilometers have given rise to the question of the environmental sustainability, and we try to see that how the wildlife conservation is going to be a kind of a promissory for the present and the future generation, and what forms of the wildlife is required for natural stability and creating an ecological balance in the wake of 81 species of mammal, 38 species of bird, 18 species of amphibian and reptile, which are supposed to be on the brink of endangerment and extinction. How the importance of wildlife, which is spread, it is diversity, and the biodiversity is going to be addressed under the legal domain, what we can term as the wildlife conservation and protection law lecture. We will try to see that how this India's rich biodiversity is going to, which houses 75,000 animals and species, and including 2,000 fishes, 4,000 mollusks, 5,000 insects, 442 reptiles, 140 amphibians, 340 mammals, and 1,200 birds which flock in one season or another in the India's rich biodiversity, which have a direct impact on the wildlife conservation and protection. Then we try to devote our attention to the very fact that how deforestation and habitat destruction, poaching and illegal trade in wildlife and environmental disaster and indiscriminate deforestation and the human negligence and depredation in the animal ecosystem have been a major source of threat to wildlife and ecosystem. We will also examine that in case of tiger population, that what has been the major factor which have led to the diminishing population of the tiger because of either by loss of habitat or because of the illegal trafficking or the poaching, and how the tiger census which has been carried in 1972 recorded only 1827 tiger across India and highlighted the need to protect all the species of the tiger which happens to be in the wildlife conservation and parks and sanctuaries. According to the latest list of 2022, that estimated tiger population ranges from 3,167 to 3,925 tigers, with an average estimated to be 3,600. So, right from 1972 right to 2022, and the average figure of the tiger by a rough estimation appears to be slightly higher, and then this represents that how the in case of tigers population, India's effort of of establishment of the National Tiger Conservation Authority have resulted into a 24% increase in its population, but how it can be maintained 6.1% per year is a question for any kind of a conservationist or any person who is engaged into the law and interested into the wildlife conservation laws and policy. Then we see that as we have a project Tiger, we have a project Elephant which has been launched in 1992 in the wake of the indiscriminate death of the elephant in the Kaziranga National Park in Assam, and we'll be also looking as the notable wildlife sanctuary and national park, including the Gir National Park, which habitates and which is a home for the Asiatic lions, and we will also see that how Kaziranga National Park in Assam is a home for a one-horned rhinoceros, and we will be also looking at the famous Periyar National Park in Kerala, which try to conserve the wild elephants, and then we try to see that how in Jammu and Kashmir the preservation of the Hangul in the Dachigam National Park and the Kashmiri stag is going to happen in the entire networking of the wildlife sanctuary and the national park, that how these prominent national parks have come to protect the most endangered species in India. We will also try to see that how the role of wildlife in the ecosystem balances the natural process, maintains ecological stability, and it contributes significantly into the climate regulation, pollination, and soil fertility, besides developing its biodiversity and the food chain integrity, and it ensures a kind of a continuity of the natural resources for the present and as well as the future generation, and try to establish the ecological balances and biodiversity by underlining the interconnectedness of the human, animal, and wilderness into one. And this is where is the role of the wildlife conservation and protection law, that interconnectedness and the interdependability of the human, animals, and wildlife is very important in the spectrum of the wildlife in the ecosystem. And we also try to look at that how the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 is a very comprehensive law, but that is not in existence in isolation, because that law also needs a strong support of the different law in matters of, as we see that the Forest Conservation Act 1981, which try to see that the afforestation and social forestry, and try to see the forest coverage to be increased, as we have seen in case of the National Tiger Project, that right from the Tiger Census of 1972 down to 2022, we have registered some kind of increase. Similarly, in case of the loss and denudation of the forest resources has been one of the major threat to the very existence and identity and survival of the wildlife identities. And then we have to see with a very holistic framework that what is wildlife protection, what is forest law, what is forest conservation. Alongside, we have to develop and we have to see that how the Custom Act 1962 and how the Prevention of Cruelty to Animal Act have also added a new dimension to the legal framework of wildlife protection in India, and adoption of the International Convention on Migratory Species of the Bird of 1972 that India has ratified, how the broad goals and the professed goal of 1972 convention is going to be replicated under its national laws and policy, including the wildlife, forest, and as well as the animal law or the animal protection law. We will also try to look at the wildlife conservation and protection law in a context of the international wildlife, and a reference to international wildlife law is becoming very important, because we have to deduce the international legal norms out of the globally, and then we try to look at the nationally. Despite that India has been a forerunner in implementing the key wildlife conventions and treaties, there is a need that more and more endangered flora and fauna are to be incorporated within the canvas of the Indian wildlife law, and we have to give effect to the in letter and spirit what has been contained in the CITES 1972, and the domestic commitment or the national commitment of the country must be in line with and work in tandem with the international legal wildlife laws and the entire spectrum of the international wildlife law. In this context, we have already hinted about that the Ramsar Convention on Wetland 1972, Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of the Wild Animals, Bonn Convention, Wildlife Protection, and Indo-USSR Migratory Bird Conventions are very important in shaping the wildlife law in this country. We also see that the peripheral legislation which talks about the waterfall and the wetland habitat, waterfall habitats and wetland, and the Bonn Convention, which was signed by the 50 countries in 1979, came into force in India in 1983. Thus, we see that as Ramsar was ratified in 1981, the Bonn Convention was ratified in 1983, and India also signed the Indo-USSR Convention on Migratory Bird, and it remains to be said that India is a country which attracts a large number of birds from the Russia and USSR. That's why this convention is of a very seminal significance, because in the winter season the birds from Siberia and happens to visit the Indian North India in a great number, and then their migratory patterns are being realized under the Indo-USSR Convention on Migratory Bird, which was ratified in 1984. Thus, alongside we see that these laws has also been infiltrated some kind of provisional adjustment in the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which tries to complement the state level animals protection law vis-a-vis the concern of India's participation in the international convention is to be taken care of within the precincts of the uh, national wildlife law. We see that the important birds and biodiversity area IBA concept has developed and applied over 30 years, and it has recognized the international governmental bodies and international treaties, including the most prestigious convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Ramsar Convention on waterfall habitat and wetland, and thus it focuses that the birds and biodiversity and the wetland goes along, and unless we realize that the birds, the biodiversity and the wetland happens to be having a kind of a joint existence, and there is an interconnectedness that has to be highlighted in the Indian vision of the biodiversity conservation laws and policy. And Ramsar Convention, which has been passed in 1971 and being ratified in 1981, then India have protected the Montreux record, and it has also recognized the Ramsar sites. So in India is having a long list of the Ramsar site of, meaning thereby the wetlands of international importance, as well as India has a long list of the Montreux record, which is a wait and watch policy of the Ramsar Secretariat. Thus, what we can say that the more we have the Ramsar site, be that the Montreux record or the Ramsar wetland of Ramsar importance, it appears that these have a direct nexus on the conservation effort of the wildlife protection and conservation. Convention on Biological Diversity 1992, which entered into force in 1993, and it has been ratified by the overwhelming number of the countries of the world, have three basic objectives. The one is the sovereignty over the natural resources, conservation of the biological diversity, sustainable use of natural resources, and fair and equitable benefit sharing of the genetic resources. Then the compliance of the three objectives of the Biodiversity Convention is also a complementary role in shaping India's biodiversity laws and policy. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species is most notable convention which have emerged as one of the most international concern, and it directly try to see that it regulates the all kind of wildlife trafficking and all kind of poaching, all kind of trafficking, all kinds of trophies, all kind of the trade in wildlife is being banned under this, and therefore India, being the signatory to the site, adheres this regulation and try to see that the basic ethos which have been underpinned in the CITES convention are to be given some very practical and concrete shape in the India's laws on conservation of the wildlife. The Bonn Convention on the Migratory Species of 1979 and including the Indo-USSR Convention on Migratory Species are very important because this convention has also been ratified by the India and it is very effective. The objective of this convention is the protection of migratory species that crosses international barrier, and it also recognizes the conservation failure by in one country which impact the other country into the entire sustenance and survival of the migratory bird, and thus it seeks to cooperation and collaboration so that the joint conservation effort will nurture the entire migratory species under the Bonn Convention on Migratory Species. Then we see that India and Indo-USSR Convention on Migratory Bird 1984 have various objectives, and one objective is to seek scientific collaboration and resource management for migratory bird, and India between India and USSR. So this is a bilateral kind of a convention wherein we find sustainable wetland management, we find focus studies on the bird migration pattern, and we also try to see under this convention that what are the avifaunal nesting sites supporting conservation regime, and in the context of the wetland and the plain land and their flora and fauna, and it also try to see the entire water resource management and hydrology which have some impact in promoting the Indo-USSR Convention on Migratory Bird, and we try to see that any kind of mitigation of the environmental pollution which result into the restrictions of the migratory routes and migratory collaborations or migratory ways and pathways are to be looked under the Indo-USSR Convention, being a bilateral convention which the India has agreed in 1984. Thus, we see that how India, under the canvas and the scope and ambit of a large number of the international law relating to the wildlife, have tried to shape the Wildlife Protection Act, Environment Protection Act, and Forest Conservation Act 1981, and thus these obligations have slightly penetrated into these laws, and now we will be looking at the wildlife policies and action plan. So not only on the aspect of the legal incorporations of these international norms, which international wildlife norms, inserting into the wildlife law and having a peripheral mention into the Environment Protection Act and having a direct bearing on the Forest Conservation Act, we will also be looking at the Wildlife Protection Act along with its National Wildlife Action Plan of 1983, 2002 to 2016, and 2017 to 2031. So a slew of law and policy is very important to look at the entire wildlife policy and the action plan, because these laws have a direct connectivity with the policy specification, and these initiatives always strengthen the conservation, restoration, and sustainable management of the biodiversity across the country. So once we are going to look at the basic precepts of the wildlife conservation and protection law under this lecture, we should not be very oblivious of the fact that besides having the international legal norm, besides having its connection with the importance, while understanding the importance of wildlife conservation and looking at India's rich biodiversity and identifying the major threats to wildlife and ecosystem, and in relation to Project Tiger, in relation to Project Elephant, and in relation to some of the very prominent national wildlife sanctuary and national park. And we will try to see that the role of wildlife in the ecosystem, which recognizes interconnectedness of the human, animals, and wilderness. And then we have to take a very holistic understanding of a long list of international wildlife law, starting from Ramsar Convention, starting from the International Convention on Migratory Species of the Bird, the Bonn Convention, Indo-USSR Convention, and and important bird and biodiversity area convention, convention on biological diversity, convention on international trade in endangered species, Bonn Convention, Indo-USSR Convention, and how these major conventions have tried to shape the entire canopy and the canvas of the wildlife protection law. And we also try to mix that how the wildlife protection law 1972 time to time has taken important feedbacks from the national policy, and we have three major policy, one in 1983, another in 2002, another in 2017. So all these three policies must be understood in a very holistic perspective. So whatever has happened in wildlife laws and policies right from 1972, 1983, 2002, 2017, we have to see that the National Wildlife Action Plan in 1983, how it has fostered a legal framework for wildlife conservation in India by managing and protecting 67 national parks, 394 sanctuaries covering about 4% of India's geographic landmark, and how it additionally protected 107 zoos, 49 deer park, 16 safari park, 6 snake park, and 24 breeding centers and 6 aquarium. So the focus of the 1983 National Wildlife Action Plan, being the first wildlife action plan, needs to be examined in its proper context of ex situ and in situ conservation of the species, and in restoration of degraded habitat, as well as the rehabilitation of endangered species to protect the very genetic continuity of the wildlife in multiple areas, so that India must have a very comprehensive wildlife policy and action plan. So the action plan includes a very scientific management of the zoological and botanical garden. It also tried to look at the captive breeding program and threatened species. It also adopt professional management cadres for the promotion of wildlife education, research, and monitoring, besides having awareness for the wildlife for human welfare. And the comprehensive policy framework of the National Wildlife Action Plan also touches on the issue to the commercial exploitation of the natural resources, growth in human and livestock population, and it examines that what are the shifting consumption pattern which have a direct bearing of replacing and changing the environmental and socio-economic realities in the very policy perspective of advancing wildlife protection and sustainable use. Then we see that this plan of 1983, along with the broad discussion which we had about the wildlife action plan, is very important, and it is very important in the sense that it is being continued by 2002 wildlife action plan, and which have focused on the area of the new reserve category. So we see a clear departure of the National Wildlife Action Plan from 1983 to 2001 and its continuity, and that continuity is important in advancing wildlife protection and sustainable use. And how it is going to happen, that we try to see that it has strengthened and expanded the protected area network, and it tries to conserve the endangered species and habitat, and it tries to control the wildlife product trade by advancing meaningful researches, education, training, and advocacy. And the true endorsement of the new protected area categories under the National Wildlife Action Plan of 2002-2016, meaning thereby has given emphasis to the conservation reserves and the community reserves. And conservation reserve here means that the corridors connecting to protected area, and the community reserve here means the areas managed by the local community participation. So the new protected area categories which have been introduced by the National Wildlife Action Plan is very important, which talks about the sense of belongingness of the indigenous community, and as well as the state sponsored activities which are being practiced in the National Wildlife Action Plan phase 2, that is 2002 to 2016. The National Wildlife Action Plan 2002 to 2016 have also embraced certain innovative features, and that innovative features is the corridors which are brought to new reserve category, and it emphasize on the people's participation and local communitarian approach, and try to seek voluntary relocation and rehabilitation of the villages so that the human wildlife conflict can be resolved amicably, and some compensation mechanisms are to be engrafted to support and restore the degraded habitat beyond protected area. The Wildlife Action Plan of 2017 and 2013, which is the third phase of the National Wildlife Action Plan, happens to address the issue of 17 happens to highlight the interconnection between the ecosystem health, human survival, and sustainable development. So at one place it talks about the human ecosystem health, it talks about the human survival, and it also talks about sustainable development, and it adopts a very broader ecosystem based approach covering both fauna and flora. And therefore what we find that in this respect we see the National Wildlife Action Plan 2017 to 2013 is very important from the point of view of a great degree of advancement of the National Wildlife Action Plan third, which try to emphasize conservation of natural habitat and genetic diversity, promotion of sustainable use of the species and ecosystem, and the current area network which it tries to cover is 733 sites covering almost 1,60,901 square kilometer, and thus the entire national park, wildlife sanctuary, conservation reserves, and community reserve is being incorporated by recommending an expanding role of the protected area to include terrestrial, island water, and marine ecosystem with a high conservation value. Thus, we see that India's National Wildlife Action Plan 2017 have devoted to the issue of the freshwater biodiversity, river ecology, human-wildlife conflict, tourism and conservation, and it tries to adopt a kind of a funding and institutional mechanism to encourage private sector engagement through corporate environmental social responsibility, and advocates for training of the local community as a natural guide, and ensuring tourism revenue to be reinvested in the protected area management. Thus, we see the reach of the National Wildlife Action Plan at one hand touches the biodiversity, it also tries to examine the climate change scenario and its impact on the wildlife. Thus, we see taken as a whole, the entire strategy and objective of the wildlife protection happens to meet the constitutional goal of the forest protection and as well as the wildlife protection, as it has been inserted into Article 48A, which talks about the state is directed shall endeavor to protect and improve environment and safeguard forest and wildlife. So environment, forest and wildlife, that forest and wildlife is included, and at the same time under Article 51AG it has been mandated to all citizens to protect and improve the natural environment including forest and wildlife of the country. With this we see that entry 17 forest list was brought to concurrent list, and entry 17B that deals with the protection of wild animals and birds into the concurrent list from the state list, and have it is seen to be a great moment for any conservationist to look at the shifting of the wildlife from a state list to concurrent list, and thus we see that the directive principles of state policy and the lawmaking power which has been conferred to the central government will create a very robust kind of a conservation mechanism and a very legally sustainable kind of a conservation mechanism within the precincts and boundaries of the international law dealing with the wildlife conservation. And thus we see that the wildlife conservation and protection law in India can have all kind of the modern inspiration expectation from the conservationist point of view, and at the same time meeting the broad goals of international wildlife law. With this, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.